Investigating the architecture of the ancient Greek world is filled with numerous challenges. Virtually all documentary records of their initial creation, if they existed at all, have long since disappeared, while the vast majority of the physical structures are left in ruins. At first glance, the process of any substantial reconstruction of what they looked like centuries ago, let alone what might have been going on in the minds of their creators, seems hopeless. Thankfully, as the engaging ancient Greek architectural historian Sam Holzman tells us, that turns out not to be the case. By a careful analysis of the numerous small details hiding in plain sight, from double-sided capitals, to curiously angled stones, to aesthetically compelling restoration efforts, there's an enormous amount that we can still discover about these marvelous buildings and the many dedicated and determined individuals who made them. Sam Holzman, welcome to Exploring Art History.
Thanks for having me, Howard.
Okay. You are the most enthusiastic guest. You know what? Right now, I'm going to say I should have you on again. So, regardless
of wait an hour, you'll see. No, I just watched the episode you posted with Susan Dackerman, which was great.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So, we're going to talk about something quite different, about archaeology and architectural history. And particularly in the classical world, of which you are a specialist. And I'd like to get a sense from you on your personal journey. So how did all that begin for you, both in terms of passion for the classical world and in terms of architecture?
Oh, it's the amalgam of a bunch of serendipitous circumstances. You know, I had the opportunity to study Latin and Greek in school, and that really opened my eyes to how interesting the ancient world is. Just hearing the voices of ancient people speak in literature. And then I had the fabulous opportunity to go to Greece when I was in college, as a student in college here in Athens. And I had the most amazing teacher, a guy named Tassos Tannoulas, who was the architect in charge of the restoration of the Propylaea. And, you know, getting to go up on the scaffolding on the Acropolis as a college student with him, I didn't even know that being a scholar of ancient Greek architecture was a job option until I had this guy. And I thought, oh, this is really cool. I'd like to do this. And that was 15 years ago. And Tassos and I remain in constant contact and things. It was wonderful teachers all along the way, and which I suppose is a cliched answer, but I suspect that it's what you'll hear from a lot of professors.
Yeah, but just to back up a little bit, so your undergraduate degree was in classics then? Is that what you did, or how did that work?
Yeah, I studied classics at Brown, which was a fantastic opportunity. I had some great professors there. Johanna Hanink was my senior thesis advisor back in the day, but also archaeology. I studied with Sue Alcock, and that set me on a path to the study of Greek architecture really is a kind of hybrid subject. It sits in between, architectural history and also archaeology and also, dealing with ancient texts.
Yeah. And with respect to architecture, I mean, I know you've also taught courses in architectural drawing, and we're going to get into some of the hopefully technical techniques and so forth. Was that also something when you were a kid you were interested in or fascinated by, or not so much?
There was no escaping it in a way. Both of my parents are architects. When I was a kid, on the weekends, when my dad would go into the office, he'd take me in and he'd put me up on the drafting board, and give me some pens and pencils, to keep myself busy. And I looked into architecture and worked in architecture offices and museum exhibition design offices and sort of thought about this and picked up drafting skills. But then I had the chance to actually work with some archaeological illustrators. I took archaeological drawing from the late, great Penelope Mountjoy, who was just the maven of drawing Mycenaean pottery. And she taught me how to draw with a rapidograph pen, something that, is as far away from us today as Mycenaean pottery. And but it was an amazing training in the skills and techniques of drawing by hand. And it's something that I use today in everything I do, even though it's all digital now.
Yeah, cool. So a couple of more questions, again, for me as an outsider, to try to get an understanding of the field and the sociology of the field and the mechanisms of that sociology. So I understand that you're the head of the research team at Samothrace. So how does that sort of thing happen? So you're affiliated with the American School of Athens, as I understand it, and a bunch of other organizations, and then presumably there's, or maybe not, but I can imagine the Greek government is somehow involved in some of this stuff. How do you get to be the lead investigator on a project like that?
So American Excavation Samothrace is sort of a team project, and our leader is Bana Westcoat, who's at Emory University and the current director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And this is a long-running excavation. It was started in 1938 by an amazing scholar named Carl Lehmann, who was a professor at NYU, who was very interested in sort of all kinds of subjects, including the connections between early Christianity and Hellenistic mystery cults. And so this set him on a mission to dig up and investigate the sanctuary of the great gods on Samothrace. And he started that project in the late 30s and then picked it back up again after the war, totally in partnership with the Greek government and under the auspices of the Ephoria of Eastern Thrace. And we have a number of investigators. My colleague Andrew Ward, who teaches at Fairfield University, oversees the excavation side of things. We have conservators, we have object specialists and the like, but it's a really interesting site for architecture. There are some amazing, innovative buildings that were set up there. I should backtrack and say why Samothrace is important. It was a mystery cult. It goes back to the early Archaic period that we have evidence for activities, but it's involved in some world historical events. The parents of Alexander the Great, Philip of Macedon and Olympias, arranged their marriage there. It's probably wasn't a meet cute, but for all of the followers of Alexander, this was a place to stake your claim to his legacy. And they built fabulous dedications there. And ultimately, it was this important Macedonian sanctuary. And when it all comes crashing down after the Romans defeat the Macedonians at the Battle of Pydna, Perseus, the last Macedonian king, he runs off to this sanctuary to hide out, and they drag him out to be led in triumph in Rome. And so over a roughly 200-year period, this place was really important. And so in terms of the history of architecture, a lot of novel ideas are developed there. And so, for somebody with a T-square, it's an exciting place to do research. I like to emphasize sort of the discoveries that we've made in the last couple of years, in part because I think how do I put this? It reaffirms why we study these things. People have been looking at ancient Greek temples for more than 250 years, and it's always reassuring to see that we're discovering new things, and that it's worth continuing to investigate this, because there's stuff that's hiding in plain sight sometimes that we just haven't hit upon yet, and that there are chapters of the story of Greek architecture that haven't been written yet.
Yeah, I'd like to get to those obviously shortly, but before I do, maybe you can just give some précis of some of the essentials in terms of architectural orders, the impact of someone like Vitruvius and so forth, just to set us up for people who don't have any background whatsoever in understanding what we're talking about, because, or at least what you're going to be talking about, because I think it's essential to have some level of background to fully appreciate the impact that your research has had.
Sure. I mean, so let me define it. I mean, Greek architecture was an art form of orders, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. And these began as regional styles in different parts of the ancient Greek world. Doric in mainland Greece and the Peloponnese, and the western colonies of the Achaeans and the Corinthians in Sicily and South Italy. This is really distinctive because it has these column capitals with a pillowy echinus and often austere decoration. And in the Greek East, in Asia Minor, in the region called Ionia, we see the emergence of the Ionic order, which you will know how to spot because it has its capitals with two curling volutes on either side. And this gets a reputation in antiquity for being more ornate and elaborate. And these emerge really in the 6th century BC, Doric a little bit earlier than Ionic. And then in the 4th century, we see the flowering of Corinthian as a new style. And ultimately, a lot of Greek architecture really is the story of the blending and the combination of these different regional forms together on outside and inside, how they play off one another. But it is a structuring language for how we talk about the art form that is architecture in antiquity, in much the same way that the Greeks framed their discussion of music in terms of modes, and that there was, a Dorian mode and an Ionian and a Lydian and a Mixolydian and other kinds of things. These species of talking about scales was very similar to the terminology that they used to talk about architecture. And all of this we get a crystal clear picture of this because in the 15th century, the manuscript of a Roman writer named Vitruvius was rediscovered and propagated in the Renaissance. It really even rebooted the ancient Greek term architecton, as a new term for a master builder, as a polymath, educated in all kinds of things, who was interested in issues of harmony and proportions and the like. This Roman writer, Vitruvius, you need to think of him as active in the 20s, the decade of the 20s BC, which doesn't, may not register as an important decade in world history. But, at the beginning of that decade, the emperor, Octavian, soon to become Augustus, conquers Alexandria, and it's the incorporation of the last of the big Hellenistic Greco-Macedonian kingdoms into Rome, and the consolidation of Roman control of the Mediterranean, and the beginning of Augustus's building project. And Vitruvius absolutely wanted to get in on this at the ground floor, and he writes this book that tries to summarize a lot of Greek knowledge about architecture in Latin for a Roman audience, kind of as a sort of resume of everything that he could do in the service of this new autocratic regime. And, ultimately, this is the moment when Augustus will later boast that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And so Vitruvius is in some ways a key source in summarizing a lot of what had happened in the world of art and architecture in the previous 500 years. But he was already, 450 years late to the story of, say, the building of the Parthenon. And so some of what he has to say is a little bit garbled, and he gives us key elements of terminology. But as people began to investigate in classical lands of what were the Ottoman Empire, starting in the late 1740s, 1750s, with folks like Stuart and Rivette, they started to notice that there were some differences. And so this history of Greek architecture is really the modern history of this discipline. It picked up from there as a story of disentangling and setting the record straight from these valuable ancient sources.
Yeah. So I want to get into those details shortly. Before I do, I'd like to ask you one more question about the tools that you're using for your research. So my understanding is that among many other things, you've been involved in something called the Parthenon Restoration Project. You've been involved in a visual reality teaching app called Athens Reborn, but the Acropolis. So first of all, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that in terms of the modern tools that we're using now to study this field, but also I'm wondering if there are any architectural historians that are pushing back on any of this.
I think that there's an interplay between modern technology and tried and true methods of drawing by hand. Although we get new tools that will aid us in doing new things and doing stuff more efficiently, I often think of them as new additions to our toolkit, as opposed to sort of supplements that have left sort of older tools in the dustbin. And so, yes, we use all kinds of new digital methods. So we're constantly doing sort of photogrammetric modeling, where we take sort of cameras or drones that have cameras on them and making 3D models of stuff. Or we're doing laser scanning, where we have handheld laser scanners. And these are enormous tools that allow you to make totally orthographic images, where you sort of take all perspective out of the shot. In fact, the two Ionic Capitals on the cover of my book, which are from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, those are laser scans, orthographic images at high resolution, so that you can look totally frontally at them, but you still get a sense of their color and texture and stuff. So those tools are extremely important, but I also still have hand drawing tools. And so take the image down, Howard. I'm going to show you something even better that I don't think you, I brought some toys, which are that, we have, hand measuring tools. This is, a profile gauge, which is like, we use it for drawing pottery and the like, where you can press it against an object and start to get the silhouette of a piece of pottery. This is sort of an essential tool for creating drawings that diagram the profiles of all kinds of artifacts. And we use these also for drawing things like moldings in architecture. So in fact, I have a set of these that's for architectural drawing that sort of start to capture the profile of things, and they're modular, and you can clip them all together and transcribe them onto sheets of paper. And especially when you're dealing with stuff that's so carefully fit together, where you have marble blocks, you want to measure everything to the millimeter, and you want to double check that you've gotten it all right. And it's very useful to have a digital model, but nothing reassures you quite like reading the tape measure yourself.
Yeah, I'm sure. So let's get into retrospective columns, which I understand was an embellishment, or at least based upon your doctoral thesis. Is that correct? So give me a sense of, first of all, how you got involved in this particular topic. Well, maybe what the topic actually is, and then how you got involved in it, and then we'll move towards insights, conclusions, all the rest of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so there are some major stylistic changes that happen in Greek architecture between the 6th century BC, which we often shorthand as the Archaic period, and the Classical period, which begins in the 5th century BC. And one of the big switches that we see, especially in Ionic, that you will, once you see it, you can't sort of unsee it, is that these early Ionic temples, the coiled volutes of the capitals are bulging and convex. They have this sort of doughy appearance where everything looks kind of soft, because all the elements are carved bulging outwards. And in the Classical period, they switch to concave carving, where the volutes are tunneled out. Vitruvius uses the word canalis, a channel, to talk about these elements. He didn't even know that there was a version of this that wasn't concave. And, there's a clear rationale for doing this. It creates rich shadow contrast. And it's a move toward more expressive carving that we see not only in architecture, but especially in what's happening with sculpture at this period. And so this is a sort of a useful way of classifying objects. And if you see one of these, you think, I know when that dates to. That's from, the middle of the 6th century BC up until maybe 480. And then if you see a concave one, you know you have a clear chronological cutoff. The ones that are on the cover of my book are the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which was supposedly, according to Vitruvius, the first Ionic temple ever built, the starting place of this aesthetic tradition. Of course, archaeological discoveries have shown that Ionic took shape gradually over not only the region of Ionia, but also the Cyclades, and that different elements appear, and it's really an agglomerative story, but this was a landmark building in the ancient imagination. And when a fame-seeking arsonist burned it down in the year 356, it was a traumatic moment, and the Ionians, vowed that they were going to rebuild it in exactly the same way, on exactly the same spot. But of course, they updated the style, it being the late 4th century, and so you see the sort of younger, new Temple of Artemis at Ephesus below. As the implementation of the style. And sort of this was how I understood it. And then I was in Greece. I had an amazing fellowship as a PhD student at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. Actually, I was a Fulbright fellow, and I got to participate in the American Schools program, where they put you on a bus and they take you to see every archaeological site in Greece. It takes months. But it is an experience like no other, and it's a chance to see everything. And I can't remember, if it was the Thessaloniki Museum or it was in Kavala. I saw one of these monuments where you have column capitals that on one side, they do it in one style, and then the other side, they're in another. And they completely turn on its head, kind of how we often think about style in archaeology, that it's convenient for us to treat style as a subconscious thing, as something that just naturally changes at specific points in time. And of course, ancient carvers, they weren't blind to the stylistic pluralism around them. The fact that there were older buildings that they admired and that they drew some things from. And so in my dissertation, I started sort of hunting all these down to make photogrammetric models of all of them, to try to bring together what these monuments so that we could look at them across Greece, Italy, and Turkey. So that was sort of where the project began, was trying to understand these monuments. And one of the touchstones is the Temple of Athena Tracheia, which was built at Ephesus, also in the aftermath of the destruction of the Temple of Artemis, which probably there's a group of capitals that were found reused in the theater of Ephesus that, they're not reused in the theater, they're reused in the fortification wall in the area of the theater when the city sort of gets a new ring of fortifications in late antiquity. And this was a temple that marked the spot where Ephesus was supposedly founded. So the fact that they had a series of columns that recreated the style of that temple that had been burned down, that was so crucial to Ephesian identity, shows the Ephesians themselves trying to keep alive elements of the history of architecture that were key to their conception of their place in the world and in history.
Yeah. And you make a distinction throughout many of the sites, not just this one, but the sites with these so-called, I just use your terminology, or at least a terminology which has been adopted, which is this notion of bilingualism, which I actually think is a funny idea, but as I understand it, that came from Beasley and vases and so forth.
I've borrowed this term bilingualism to talk about these. It's an imperfect metaphor, but it will be known to students of Greek art from the case of bilingual vases, which are a cluster of Athenian Attic vases, which are begun to be made at the end of the 6th century, that are in two different painting styles, or in two different painting techniques. They are in the older black figure technique, where painters use slip to make the figure themselves. and then the newer red figure technique where sort of an outline was painted around the figure. And oftentimes these are presented usefully in textbooks as transitional objects that show us sort of the moment that they figured out the new technique, because they show them in dialogue with each other. But as a number of scholars have pointed out, well, these aren't really the first red figure technique vases. And they exist at a moment when both styles are current. And what's quite remarkable about examples where we see, say, the same image represented on both sides, it's a celebration of technique itself. These are works of art that are reveling in the craft through which they're made, and the kinds of visual complexity you could make through things like inverted images. And so scholars actually beginning in the 1960s and 70s occasionally compared these capitals to the bilingual vases. And I think it's a sort of a useful metaphor for talking about them, although it's not maybe how we would use a term like bilingual to talk about art in other periods, the way in which, say, an artist like El Greco was a bilingual artist who was part of both sort of the post-Byzantine world of painting and sort of the Western painting tradition, Western European painting tradition. But I think they're useful here, and they resemble a number of kinds of artifacts, including also incuse coins that have convex images on one side and concave images on the other, almost as if a design has been pushed through from one side to pop out the other, and that you could turn over in your hands and feel the tactile quality of objects that had different treatments, whether they were intaglio or in relief on opposite faces.
Yeah, and one of the things that really stood out for me reading your book was this idea, again, of pushing back a little against this simplistic, teleological, Whiggish perspective of, well, first we were here, and then we improved a little bit and we're there, and then we moved forwards again on the road to the ideal form a few years later. And you're saying that there are all sorts of reasons for people to have been doing this. And one of the reasons might just be a sheer love of variety, just a sheer love of the ability to do things in different ways, appreciating them, not so much saying, well, this is much better than that, or even necessarily specifically invoking the past, although presumably that played some kind of a role, but just a celebration of doing things in a different, variety-rich way, which was, well, it was quite an intriguing idea for me.
Things, Howard. I mean, I think this is one of the important points around which the project grew as I thought about turning a dissertation about 8 Ionic column capitals into a book that would have a much wider audience. And this idea of a love of variety, has an ancient term. It's poikilia, this sort of concept of the thing that is variegated, that's multicolored, that's decorated. And this is an important aesthetic concept in ancient Greece. And it's absolutely one of the elements that's at play here. An ancient viewer might have thought of one of these as poikilos, as varied, decorated, in its treatment. And the project, got me interested in issues of painting, in polychromy in ancient architecture, the fact that we have some examples of Ionic temples where different capitals are painted differently in the same building. And it got me interested in the kinds of tricks that stone carvers play, where they will often vary different carving techniques in different parts of ornament, as part of building up visual richness through variation. And so those were two of the areas where I really expanded this project, as I developed it.
So now I'd like to move, if I may, to a very different project. Some visual evidence, somewhat surprising, as to how building techniques that we naturally have come to associate with Roman techniques actually might have had, actually do have a precedent in the Greek world. And so I'll turn it over to you to talk about that. But before I do, I'd like to ask a question that hopefully you can unfold the answer to in your statement, which is, so I'm not a civil engineer, but I have a more scientific technical background. And it's always astounded me when it comes to architecture, how people were able to build things and build such incredibly ornate, complex structures without a fundamental understanding of, let's say, gravitational principles or Newtonian mechanics or what have you. Now, this is perhaps a bias that I have in favor of formal approaches. That I come from a tradition where you have these various principles and then you build up your laws based upon these principles and then everything follows from there. And I certainly don't want to in any way impugn the importance of experience and a general sense of how things work just through empirical means over the centuries. But it's still amazing to me, and maybe this is just a reflection of my ignorance, but it's amazing to me how people were able to compensate for things like tensile stresses and understand compression and all the rest of that without having a clear basis of the physical principles that were involved. So I don't know if this makes any sense to you.
Does it make any sense to me? I usually take a semester to teach this, Howard. Of course. No, I mean this is one of the fundamental issues, and I think it's one of the inspiring issues of why we study this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely, this is crucial. Sometimes when I teach, we get out, Princeton has a copy of Galileo's Two New Sciences, where he details the idea of strength of materials and trying to use numbers to talk about, analyze, and estimate how things like beams will operate under stress. And of course, he didn't get it totally right, but he's sort of the moment when these kinds of techniques, analytical techniques that we now use, start to be developed. And so before that, essentially, everybody's working blind in terms of how they understand how these things are working. I mean, this was, Galileo marks the beginning of this analytical framework. And so, yes, I mean, that's kind of a hard line. But I'm going to totally steal one of my colleagues' ways of framing this. I have the great pleasure of teaching with an amazing civil engineer, Branko Glisic. We taught a Greek architecture class where we got to take some of our students to Greece. I did the sort of historical aesthetic component, and he did the how it stands up part of it, which was fantastic. And Branko has a fantastic line. I shouldn't say it like a line, but the way that he frames it is, and so I can't really speak for all civil engineers when I say this, but so much of this is about intuition and experience and a curiosity to try new things. That those are essential to architecture and engineering and design. And the analytical, mathematical side of it, using things like, beginning with graphic statics, just diagramming out vectors, that's kind of doing, showing your work mathematically, trying to figure out how it's going to work. And that in some way, there's a fundamental curiosity that drives people to do that. And that was common to people in antiquity. They may not have had any of the analytical tools, but they had curiosity, they had patience, they had a certain degree of tolerance for risk and experimentation and embracing failure. And we get this from writers like Vitruvius, who tells us about failed buildings that didn't work, and about how they learned from that. he tells us how far apart you think you can get columns before you can't make them out of stone anymore. And I love the 4th century writer named Theophrastus tells us a story. He's writing about different types of wood, and he encourages builders to use sweet chestnut wood because this kind of wood, for making roofs, because when it starts to break, it makes a noise. And he tells us about a building on the island of Antandros that when it collapsed, everybody got out because they heard the beams failing. He said, this is why you should make all your ceilings out of sweet chestnut wood. And this is, as sort of ridiculous as a little story that is, it's exactly lessons learned being passed on orally from one builder to another, and it's how people learned in antiquity. And one of the things that I'm currently working on right now, which is it's an interesting project, I'm partnered with Bronco on it, and also one of our former students, a civil engineer named Johnny Gagnon, and a civil engineer from Bologna, Antonio Maria d'Altri. And we've been analyzing some beams from Samothrace, and I have a 3D model of one of them here, which are these amazing beams that hold up the coffered ceiling of the Huron in the Sanctuary of the Great Gods. And they have a peaked spine in the middle. They aren't a sort of straight beam. I mean, all these elements of Greek architecture are usually sort of rectilinear. But this one has a peaked spine in the middle. And it comes from the fact that they realize that this sort of engineering principle, that beams are under their maximum stress at the midpoint, and that the strength of a beam is in its height. And in fact, we now know, that the strength of a beam is the square of its height. So by doubling it in size in the middle, they quadrupled how strong this beam was, but that it only needed to be twice as big in the middle. And they didn't need to add it at the ends. That would just be adding weight without adding strength to it. And then it's got it's sort of T-shaped in section, and then it has this little ledge so that they could then take the panels of the coffered ceiling. Here's a little centaur, that's in this panel, and he, rests on the ledge between these beams. And so they totally hide from view this element. So when you saw it from below, you saw what looked like a really thin beam, and they were pushing the limits on what stone could do. And when we did a finite element analysis of these beams, and when I say we, I mean my peers in civil engineering, what they found was, these are really close to the optimal design. Like if you gave an engineer a computer and said, design me the perfect beam, they wouldn't come up with something much different from this. And the fact that they got to that entirely by trial and error and experience from making buildings, it is impressive. It's really impressive, and it should be inspiring to us that we have it in us to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, indeed. Although I'm guessing there were, in the spirit of what you're saying, I'm guessing there were lots of buildings that were decidedly suboptimal that crashed down, and we have no record of whatsoever.
No comment on how many ancient buildings were. Absolutely. There's a dimension of learning from mistakes in antiquity.
So, thank you. That's a very exhaustive answer. Perhaps you can move to the flat arch system and in the Stoa and Samothrace.
This was a fun discovery that we made recently in our fieldwork on Samothrace. So look, this is the Temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum. It's been a building that people have studied since the Renaissance. This is a 16th century image of it. And what's remarkable about this building is, and what served as a model for architects for centuries, was, it's a beautiful Corinthian order. It's the Romans doing, Greek architecture in marble, borrowing from sort of these aesthetic paradigms, but then over top of the beams in the course of the frieze, where there's often decoration, if you look at the back side of the frieze, you'll see that the blocks aren't rectangular, but that the sides of the blocks are tilted and that they are trapezoidal in shape. And that basically you have an arch over each one of the beams. So just as builders understood that beams were under enormous amount of stress, they were adding in arches to take the weight off of these beams. You know, I ought to backtrack for a second and say that stone is enormously strong under compression. I mean, right, you can put a mountain on a piece of stone and it doesn't crack. But it is not strong under tension, relatively speaking. In fact, it's usually about 1/10 as strong. So if you start to try to bend a piece of stone, it doesn't like that. But if you put a lot of weight on it, it's fine. And this is really a limiting factor on the scale of Greek architecture, you know, also Egyptian architecture and the like, that if you put sort of upright columns, the columns themselves you could put a lot more weight on and they'd be fine. But as you start to stretch the beam out past 3.5 meters, you start to reach a ceiling on how big you could get these things. And so one of the strategies that builders use in antiquity is to try to get weight off of the beams by putting things like arches on top of them. And so for a very long time, because we have standing Roman buildings that do this, we tend to think of this as a Roman invention, that of combining sort of the aesthetic conventions of Greek architecture with the new structural potential of the arch. And so it was a little bit of a surprise to me when in the summer of 2019, 2020, when we were working on documenting this 100-meter long portico on Samothrace, our stoa, we were looking at these Doric frieze blocks, which you recognize from their triglyphs and metopes, that the angles of these blocks weren't straight. And you see you see this with your eyes, just putting an L-shaped L square on them, that they aren't a right angle. Most of these blocks are broken, and we carefully, together with a team of students and graduate students, we measured and cataloged all these blocks, and we started to put together the story that we see the triglyph blocks are cut in on the edges, and the blocks that end with a metope splay outward, and that basically we're looking at the elements of a flat arch, and that we have it on display in a Greek building in the second quarter of the 3rd century BC, right, 275 to 250, and so this is, you know, between 150 and 200 years before the first example of this that we know in Rome. But it's not a surprise to us in a way. I mean, you know, we hadn't documented one of these. In some way, it was a surprise, but it's not out of place because we have, you know, cases of arches and vaults used in Greek and Macedonian buildings up to probably the middle of the 4th century. And so it's an indication to us that almost as soon as ancient Greek builders learned how to make the arch, they started trying to find ways of using a new technology to solve a very old problem.
Yeah, and you go even further than that. I mean, because of the indentations in these I don't know what to call them. And the stones? What do you rocks? In the stuff?
Stones. Rock is attached to the ground.
As I understand it, because of these indentations, you're able to build together, you're able to build a theory about how exactly they were put together and in what order they were put together, using the dowels on some of the sides that you found, and the indentations that you've surmised correspond to being raised up by a pulley. I mean, this is actually quite fascinating. Not that the other stuff wasn't fascinating, but the level of detail that you're able to extract and come up with, and at least, maybe I'm just an easily convinced fellow, but at least what to me seems a very compelling and convincing style in terms of the order in which these flat arches and friezes and so forth were constructed, it just seems remarkable. That must have been, first of all, a great feeling, but perhaps you can give me a little bit more, or give us a little bit more of a sense of what was actually going on and how you were able to make these deductions.
Well, in some ways, let me backtrack a second and just say, because you asked me a little bit before about sort of the craft of how we study ancient architecture. And, this is a case where, we're working on a building that, it's not standing. Basically, we have it up to the level of the first step of this building is preserved in situ, and then we've got 1,700 scattered blocks. And, if I'm going to make a claim like this, I want to be 100% sure that I'm right before I go to press with it. And so it's important to kind of check every detail. And so this was an element of being 100% sure I knew what I was talking about. But before I started making claims about this, I'm really curious if it exists in other Hellenistic buildings. But this was a chance to, make sure that the dowel holes in the blocks that, where I think they go, that they line up with the other ones next to them, etc. And so making sure that I understood how every component was fitted together really was sort of crucial to making the case that this is absolutely how these blocks go back together again, before we start looking for other examples of this, which I'm sure existed in the Hellenistic period, but we just haven't found them yet.
So I'd like you to talk about the dolphin clamp, but in particular, I'd like you to start talking about the importance of stone repair, because this is something that, again, someone like me, you just don't think about. First of all, I'm not even cognizant of the idea that there has been sometimes an extensive amount of stone repair during construction, after construction of these buildings. It's obvious when it's brought to your attention, but it's not the sort of thing that you think about when you imagine a classical temple, or quite frankly, any structure. Again, if you're not perhaps a civil engineer or a construction worker or something like that. So the idea that by examining stone repair, you can actually learn deep and important things, not only about how buildings were constructed, but also to some extent about contemporary values, about aesthetics, and all the rest of that. So perhaps you can just give me a better sense of that, and even answer the question, were you aware of this? Was this something that had been first and foremost in your mind, or did this whole experience that you're about to tell me about trigger that understanding and awareness on your part?
Well, we often treat marble, white marble, as a homogeneous material. And in some ways, we've been trained to think like this. There's the great, story purported about Michelangelo that, he just looked at a block. He looked at the statue in a block of marble and subtracted, the pieces that needed to be taken away from it. The story of how people interacted with and worked with stone is an issue across time periods. That's fascinating. Yeah, stone has something to say for itself. I mean, marble, of course, also has all these veins in it that are what give it that marble effect. And when you start learning how to do stone carving, you discover as you are hammering across those veins that they have different hardnesses, and you can feel it like you're going over speed bumps as you chisel across those things that look like they're just different colors. They have a slight difference in geochemistry to them, and you feel it with your chisel.
So this brings up a point that shocked me. Maybe it was because of the blurby Princeton video I saw of you. But so I've seen physical evidence of you actually using a chisel and attacking marble. This strikes me as a very interesting thing that I would not have expected that you have done, but makes complete sense to me knowing that you did. Bill Wallace, by the way, just since we were on this theme, he also was telling me about how he had spent a lot of time not only trying to sculpt and working with marble, but actually going to the quarries where Michelangelo was and getting a very, very clear sense of that. So again, this is, I think, a little appreciated idea that scholars in this line of work really embrace that opportunity to have personal experience with working with the materials.
Oh, 100%. So this is something I started when I was doing my dissertation. I was halfway through writing about, stuff carved out of marble, and I thought, I'm writing about something I've not tried, and I really ought to do this. It would be kind of crazy to give somebody a PhD in a subject, talking about something they've never actually done. And so, I went and I did this, and I was a volunteer architect. I made some of the drawings for the Parthenon Restoration Service, and I became friendly with a lot of the marble carvers that work there, and I got to sort of shadow them. And ultimately, I did some of my own stone carving. I actually, back in the States, I'm in Greece now, I have at home a cube of Indiana limestone. I've been working on a Corinthian column capital. I put it on hold while I've been abroad. But I both show my students how to do it because I think it's really important that you try your hand at it, but you learn things from doing this. I didn't even think about the fact that stone carving, different types of stone have a smell. When you carve them, because some kinds of marble and limestone have sulfur in them, and you smell that immediately. And there are all kinds of aspects to this that you just don't even think about looking at the finished product that ultimately shaped how artists and craftspeople interacted with the material, what they made. I mean, not smell, okay, but things like the veins in stone, how far you could push it to make a span. An intuition about where something's going to crack. How do you make preventative measures? These are things that as you start to learn, and I would break this actually into two parts. One is trying it yourself, trying your hand at it, but the other part is talking to contemporary practitioners. So I've had a lot of conversations with stone carvers who are active now in Greece, folks like Petros Georgopoulos and George de Cypris, who both work for the Acropolis Restoration Service. And I've learned a lot from them in conversation that have helped explain how I understand things. I've also, as I'm interested in polychromy, I've also been working with an encaustic painter in New York, Renee Mignanti, and she very kindly did an encaustic demo for one of my classes. And I learned things doing encaustic painting that changed how I think about how ancient artists painted buildings in antiquity. Now I'm really far away from dolphins.
No, but I think it's really important. It's important for me anyway to understand. So, but back to dolphins. So over to you.
Ancient builders, they tried their hardest not to make mistakes. They were enormously careful about things, but sometimes pieces break and you worked really hard on them and they made repairs. Sometimes a block of stone that you worked really hard to quarry out of the ground, it comes out and it has a tiny little fracture in it. And they wanted ways to stabilize this. And so builders put clamps into stone to stabilize incipient cracks that were natural to the material. They also, sometimes if there were flaws in the stone, they would just cut a piece out and put a plug of a new material in as a form of repair. And we have documents about this. In fact, from not only do we have plenty of physical evidence, we have ancient inscribed building accounts from, for example, sites like Delos, where we have whole lists of, this guy's got to make this repair and that guy's got to make this repair to that. And how much the workers had to pay for making their own mistakes, and that they had to repair it on their own time and their own expense, and even they got paid sort of a symbolic fine for coming up short in the quality of the materials. So we knew about this, and by and large, we tend to think about these as intentionally being hidden. You asked me earlier, how did I learn about these ancient repairs? You didn't know about them. How did I figure out about them? And you see them at sites. Once you know how to look for them, you'll see that ancient temples are full of these like patches and holes and plugs. And what happens is, you say, what's that? And someone will say, oh, that's just a repair. It was meant to be invisible. Ignore it. and we spend so much time sort of looking past all the little material imperfections of works of art, right, to get at the notional idea. What was the artist going for in their design? Never mind, all the breaks and patches. We're trying to look at something ideal and notional, and getting past the material reality of things. And then I was in Romania. I was at the site of the ancient Greek city of Histria, Istros in antiquity, at what was once the mouth of the Danube River. And there's a beautiful Ionic column capital that cracked right down the middle. And they put a giant clamp in the shape of like a huge iron staple in the two halves of this to hold it back together again. And then they put a cosmetic patch over the front of it as a repair, and it's in the shape of a dolphin. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not how I usually think these are supposed to work. And this observation, to my mind, there's nothing else that looks like this, but it's it's an invitation for us as art historians, as scholars of antiquity, to think about how ancient craftspeople thought about these repairs a little bit differently, that they were layering in value. And in this case, if you couldn't make something look completely invisible, why not make it look beautiful? And that's what I think they did in the case of this, which is in a recent Art Bulletin article I wrote.
Great. So now I'm down to my last question, which is just a meta question, which is there anything else that you'd like to add? Did we miss something or not treat something in sufficient depth for you? Or is there anything you'd like to add just for the sake of adding it?
We didn't talk about Giulio Romano, but you'll just have to have me back for when you make a documentary film about him, because, one could go on and on about one of the greatest, most meta architects in history. I don't know. If people want to dig even further, we can put a link to the JSAH article.
Yeah. So have you spent much time in Palazzo Te, by the way? I mean, have you been to Mantua and hung out there?
Absolutely. I had the best time ever. I had to go see it for myself. And I think it's really important to, especially if you're writing about art, to go see it yourself, because you never know what's cropped out of the photo. The people have written about paintings where they're looking at a published image and it's cropped, and they miss that there's part of the painting that they're not looking at, and things like that. The case in point about measuring stones is one thing, but there are always things that you learn. You see an Ionic column capital in a textbook, and then you go see it in the museum and you realize the back side of it is totally different, which was how one of these projects started. So I had a great time visiting the Palazzo Te in Mantua, which was absolutely wonderful. And an Easter egg, which is the photo that I've published in that JSAH article, my scale figure, to call back to your first question, the scale figures in that photo are two guys. One is Basile Bodez, who's my colleague at Princeton, a phenomenal architectural historian of the modern period, who's written about color and architectural drawings. But the other one is Tassos Tanoulas, who was my professor in school, who got me started on this adventure of studying the architecture of the ancient world. He's the scale figure. Go figure.
Well, that's a great point to end it on. Sam, I want to thank you very, very much for your time. It was a fascinating conversation, and I learned a lot, and I had a lot of fun.
Thanks, Howard. It was great to chat to you, too.
Thanks very much for watching this video podcast. For more engaging art-related content, check out our Exploring Art History Substack, our short films on our Exploring Art History YouTube channel, and Ideas Roadshow's full-length documentaries. Visit our website, ideasroadshow.com, for more details.